Your four favorites are 964 Pinocchio, I Saw the TV Glow, The Doom Generation, and Donnie Darko. What stands out to me about your favorites besides the obvious transgressive, surreal, and themes of identity and sexuality is that a lot of the characters in these movies feel like outsiders or alienated or lonely. In one of your reviews for 964 Pinocchio, you even said the director makes art about what it's like to be on the fringes of society. And another director who really understands that vibe is Shunji Iwai, so I want to recommend three of his films. Picnic has characters who feel broken or like they were discarded, like 964 Pinocchio. Like I Saw the TV Glow, there's this sense of wanting to escape reality. Like the Doom Generation, it's got this drifting feeling of disaffected youth navigating a world that feels hostile or doomed. And like Donnie Darko, it feels like the character's sense of reality is unstable, and there's this whole notion of the end of the world. All About Lily Shushu also has characters who feel like outsiders. And like I Saw the TV Glow, the characters are obsessed with a form of media that makes it easier for them to cope with their daily lives, but here it's a singer instead of a TV show. And A Bride for Rip Van Winkle has those feelings of being isolated and lonely while exploring themes related to identity. And this one has a queer element, like I Saw the TV Glow and The Doom Generation. Erdal came to mind while I was watching 964 Pinocchio because even though they have very different vibes, 964 Pinocchio follows a cyborg sex slave and Erdal follows a life-size sex doll that suddenly comes to life. So both films have these characters who are treated like objects trying to navigate the world. Speaking of sex dolls and characters that are lonely, I also think you might like Lars and the Real Girl. Ichi the Killer came to mind because it explores themes of dehumanization where it feels like a character is or was being used in some way, and it's pretty graphic like 964 Pinocchio. And it's got hyper-stylized violence like the Doom Generation. Last Life in the Universe has a protagonist who's alienated and lonely, and like the Doom Generation, there's this sort of drifting feeling. But this one mainly came to mind because in one of your reviews, you said something about being alone together, and I feel like this movie explores that. I'm a Cyborg, but That's Okay also has characters who seem alienated, isolated, lonely, or broken. And the protagonist may or may not be a cyborg, like in 964 Pinocchio. But like Donnie Darko, the protagonist's perception of reality is questionable. Peep TV Show is about these outsider characters like 964 Pinocchio, and it has a sort of similar cyberpunk vibe while exploring themes of dehumanization. It's got nihilistic, alienated youth like the Doom Generation. Like Donnie Darko, it kind of questions reality. And like I Saw the TV Glow, it has a lot to do with how our screens influence our sense of identity, reality, and connection. What's interesting about your Letterboxd is that you already saw some of the more obscure movies that came to mind, but there were some movies I thought for sure you would have already seen that you didn't have marked as watched, such as Mulholland Drive. But you have other David Lynch films marked as watched, so I wasn't sure if you forgot to log this one or if you genuinely haven't seen it yet. And if you haven't seen it, I want to recommend it because it's surreal like 964 Pinocchio. Like I Saw the TV Glow, it's about identity, and the characters kind of escape into these constructed, imagined, or fictional worlds. And like Donnie Darko, it follows this sort of dream logic. Videodrome is a sci-fi body horror film that blends together sex and technology like 964 Pinocchio. It explores a lot of the same themes as I Saw the TV Glow, especially how the TV screen shapes our sense of reality. Like the Doom Generation, it's got sex, violence, and nihilism. And like Donnie Darko, the protagonist reaches a state where his sense of reality is distorted. Funeral Parade of Roses is experimental like 964 Pinocchio. It's about identity, sexuality, and gender expression like I Saw the TV Glow. And it's got sex and violence like the Doom Generation. Possessor has the body horror aspect of 964 Pinocchio. It's an exploration of identity like I Saw the TV Glow. It's got stylized violence like the Doom Generation. And like Donnie Darko, it feels as though characters can't control their own bodies. But in Donnie Darko, that's due to the sleepwalking, and in this movie, it's for very different reasons. There were a few movies that inspired 964 Pinocchio, and I know you already saw Possession, but you didn't have Blade Runner marked as watched. And I especially think you'd like the sequel, Blade Runner 2049. Edward Scissorhands came to mind because the titular character is kind of a cyborg like 964 Pinocchio in the sense that he was a science experiment that doesn't function as planned. And I mentioned characters that feel isolated in reference to your favorites multiple times already, and this movie's got that too. And in one of your reviews for 964 Pinocchio, you talked about the inherent beauty we all have inside of us and how that gets exploited by anybody and everybody, which means there's an inherent ugliness to it too. And I feel like that could also describe this movie. James Duvall is in both The Doom Generation and Donnie Darko, so I wanted to recommend another movie that he's in, and I'm gonna go with May. It has elements of body horror and deals with themes of isolation and rejection like 964 Pinocchio. And the protagonist is lonely and longing for connection, and there's a queer aspect to it like I Saw the TV Glow. It turns out I wrote down more than one movie with James Duvall in it, and the other one is SLC Punk. It's not a cyberpunk film like 964 Pinocchio, but it is a punk film, and it has these characters who are seen as outsiders. Like I Saw the TV Glow, it depicts how media shapes our sense of identity, but in this film it's about punk music, ideology, and subculture instead of a TV show. And it's got that drifting, alienated youth vibe like the Doom Generation. Speaking of punk films, I think Liquid Sky fits your vibe. It's sci-fi like 964 Pinocchio and Donnie Darko. Like I Saw the TV Glow, it's about identity, gender, and sexuality. And like the Doom Generation, it's got this stylized, alienated youth vibe. Pulse has characters that are lonely and isolated who are trying to escape from reality through media and screens like I Saw the TV Glow. And it's a horror film like 964 Pinocchio. I first heard about Electric Dragon 80,000 Volts because I saw people comparing it to 964 Pinocchio. So I watched it, and it might not delve into the themes you tend to gravitate toward, but it was awesome, so I'm gonna recommend it. Rapture has a protagonist whose perception of reality is distorted like Donnie Darko. It's an experimental horror film and a cult classic like 964 Pinocchio. Like I Saw the TV Glow, there's this fascination with visual media and screens. And like the Doom Generation, some of the characters feel sort of emotionally detached. And all the things I said about loneliness, connections, screens, and reality makes me want to recommend Speaking Parts as well.